Our movie today starts in Krishna, where the police are searching for a group of terrorists in the houses. They enter a family's home and search for the terrorists. The homeowner informs the police that only his relatives are present. However, a little girl makes a mistake and tells the police something. She reveals that her father was killed. The officer then realizes that the people in the house aren't the homeowner's relatives. They're the terrorists who killed the man's son due to a mission called Dussehra. The officer captures the group's leader, whose name is Omar, and threatens him with a gun. Omar, in turn, threatens the police, saying that within 3 months, they will destroy the entire country. Omar then takes the gun from the officer, kills the policeman, and doesn't stop there. He takes a knife and stabs the officer as well. With desperation and pleading, the homeowner couldn't distinguish them, but he had no mercy or compassion and ordered his men to finish them off. Omar then contacts a group of his men who are imprisoned in London, informing them that they've been exposed and must withdraw immediately. He reassures them that he'll be able to get them out of prison, make passports for them, and send them back to India. 3 months after these events, a man named John is watching TV in the bank. He looks sad as he listens to the news and learns that the police have captured 3 terrorists who tried to escape from prison. John then goes to the bank manager and asks to close his account entirely because his daughter is very ill and needs to travel to London for a major brain surgery. John informs the bank manager that he'll send him the money to a London bank within 2 days. The manager then calls him back, telling him that it won't be possible to transfer the money for another 10 days. John decides to buy foreign currency from a jeweler, learning that once he arrives in the country, people will exchange it. As soon as he reaches London, his daughter's condition worsens, and he rushes her to the hospital. A doctor named Nancy takes her in and provides emergency care to save her. The doctor informs John that his daughter won't be able to leave the hospital without undergoing surgery and requests that he bring the required amount as soon as possible because the operation is urgent. John calls the person who was supposed to transfer the money, and they assure him the funds will be ready. Then, his friend calls and tells him that Omar is in London. At this moment, we notice that John's expression has changed. John only cares about making sure his daughter is safe. Meanwhile, we see Omar with a tech expert asking him to hack into the prison systems. We also learn that Nancy's brother works with her at the hospital, and he asks her for money, but she refuses. The next day, Nancy meets John, and they take a taxi together. John notices one of Omar's men following them. He trails the man all the way to the hospital and learns why he's in London. The man steps out to call Omar with the information, but just as Omar answers, the man falls and hits his head, slipping into a coma. John and Nancy leave the hospital, and John shows her the money he needs to exchange, explaining that it's all he has. Nancy's brother happens to see the cash in John's hand. Meanwhile, Omar's men bring him information about the prison, and they begin planning the escape of Omar's imprisoned associates. It's revealed that all the prison doors are controlled by computers, not open manually. The tech expert also tells them that there's been an incident in the prison involving a man named Hussein, one of the most wanted criminals in Syria. He's the one controlling the prisoners there, and even introduces them to an officer named Neil and a prison guard named Sandra. We go back to John, who's trying to find the people to get the money. He's running with Nancy, and she assures him they'll reach their destination. They board a bus, but Nancy's brother secretly takes out his phone and sends a message to someone. A gang then boards the bus and starts robbing the passengers. Nancy's brother signals them toward John, and they approach him, demanding his money. John denies having any. The gang leader tries to search John and eventually finds the money on it. Nancy's brother asks John to hand over the money he was planning to exchange for his daughter's surgery. The gang leader grabs John's wallet, but John holds on to it tightly and refuses to let go. Frustrated, the gang leader punches John in the face and finally takes the wallet with the money. John tries to retrieve it, but the gang leader passes it to one of his men. As the gang taunts him, the leader throws the wallet on the ground, forcing John to bend down to pick up. When he does, one of them kicks him. John snaps and fights back, attacking the gang members. They all pull out knives and threaten him, but John overpowers them, beating them relentlessly throughout the bus ride. While John is fighting, he smashes one of the gang members' heads into the bus window, causing the person's phone to fall. He continues fighting the rest of the gang, but unfortunately, he doesn't manage to get the wallet back. The gang leaves the bus, and as John follows, the bus driver calls the police. The police arrive, and a fight breaks out between John and the officers. Eventually, they arrest him. From a distance, Nancy's brother watches and takes the fallen phone, keeping an eye on John. The The police contact the prosecutor's office, who orders John to be held until Friday, as they won't release him before then. John is taken to the station, where they confiscate all his belongings, including the money for his daughter's surgery. He tries to get the money back, but the officer in charge refuses, telling him he'll only get it when he's released. While being escorted to his cell, John notices where the money is being kept. Meanwhile, Nancy calls John, but her brother takes the phone from her and ends the call. Nancy calls to ask about John, but her brother denies knowing anything about him or having seen him. John is put in a cell, where he requests to speak with Sandra, the prison guard. She comes to meet him, and he explains that he's in London to get surgery for his daughter, sharing his whole story. Sandra doesn't believe him, so John asks her to call the hospital to verify his claim. However, it's Nancy's brother who answers the phone and denies that John's daughter is at the hospital, effectively crushing John's hope and his daughter's future. John breaks down and pleads with Sandra, but the guards come into the cell to stop him. In the cell with John is a man named Purim, who introduces himself and tries to comfort John. Later, they head to the dining hall together to get their food. As John prepares to sit down and eat, a man named Hussein approaches him and takes his meal. John stays silent, walks away, and throws his food in the trash. Hussein grabs John's hand violently, gripping it with force. John pleads with him to let go, explaining that he's new and doesn't know how things work. They drag him outside, where one of Hussein's men traps him by closing the gates. Hussein and his men surround John and beat him brutally. John is unable to defend himself and accepts his fate as Hussein's men tie him up. Hussein grabs a large rock, preparing to crush John's hand and disable him. Just before this happens, John pulls his hand away, and the police intervene, saving him from serious injury. Later, a doctor checks on John and informs Nancy that her daughter won't have the surgery unless the payment is made. John confides in his cellmate, Purim, about his situation. Purim reassures him that he'll be released the next day and may be able to arrange part of the money to help John's daughter undergo the surgery. Feeling a bit of hope, John is told by Purim that he'll request the money from the prison safe and give it to John for the surgery. Meanwhile, Neil, an officer, gives Sandra a gift and proposes to her, but she refuses. Just as this happens, John enters the scene, but Neil doesn't give him a chance to speak. Frustrated, Neil tries to punch John, but John ducks, and Neil hits the wall, injuring his hand. Angered by this, Neil has John locked up again. At the same time, the doctors decide to cancel the surgery until John shows up and pays the money. Nancy informs them that John has the funds, but the doctors tell her that he needs to come in person and sign the paperwork. This news shatters the girl's chances, and everything gets delayed due to what Nancy's brother did to John. Meanwhile, Omar's men break into the prison and hack its systems, gaining control and connecting everything to Omar. Omar sends a message to Neil, informing him that they've breached the prison systems. Omar assures Neil that he can now enter safely. Neil finds out that Sandra is still in the prison because a network malfunction has prevented her from completing her work. Omar enters and tells her to leave, offering to take over her duties. Sandra is relieved and starts packing her things to leave, but just as she's about to exit, Sandra notices that the network is down not just for her, but for all the guards. Realizing something is wrong, she becomes alarmed and orders Neil to lock all the gates and keep an eye on the situation. She rushes to the control room, where the technician informs her that the systems have been cut off. Trying to salvage the situation, she heads to the alarm system to alert the guards, only to find that the intruders have hacked and disabled the alarms too. Sandra becomes visibly anxious, fearing the worst. Omar's men, led by him, begin eliminating the guards stationed outside and unlocking the prison cells. Sandra, now panicking, orders the technician to shut everything down, but he tells her that they've lost control of the system due to the hacking. At night, all the prisoners are released from their cells, confused about what's happening. Omar takes control of the prison's PA system and announces to the prisoners that he is now in charge of the facility. He urges them to flee and return to their homes. Chaos ensues as prisoners panic and start running in all directions, each trying to find a way to escape the prison amidst the turmoil. Sandra orders the guards to stop the prisoners, but we see the inmates fighting back against the police, overwhelming them. As the chaos unfolds, Omar cuts the power, plunging the prison into darkness. The prisoners manage to subdue the guards and trap them in their cells, leaving Sandra in shock. She instructs Neil to retrieve the weapons. They rush to the armory, but find it locked. The technician informs her that Omar and his men have overridden the security system and taken full control of the prison. As Sandra heads back with Neil to the control room, she spots John and rushes after him to catch him. However, John escapes her grasp, and Neil locks the door behind her, claiming it's for her safety. Meanwhile, John manages to deliver the money to Omar and urges him to ensure his daughter gets the surgery. Omar refuses, reminding John that if he tries to escape and gets caught, he'll face a much longer sentence. Desperate to save his daughter, John decides to take matters into his own hands and escape himself. Despite Omar's attempts to stop him, John ignores the warnings and dashes away. We see Sandra sitting in front of the monitors, paralyzed and unsure of what to do. That night, the prisoners create a human pyramid to reach the ceiling, led by Hussein, who is trying to cut the electrical wires to create a way for them to climb out and escape. John is also making his way through the chaos, determined to save his daughter. John hears Omar's voice over the microphone, reassuring the prisoners that they will be set free. Recognizing Omar's voice, John remembers his friend's warning that Omar is in London. He stands there, shocked and lost in thought, and then suddenly strips off his clothes before rushing toward the inmates. He takes the opportunity to grab Hussein's wife, which surprises Sandra, who is baffled by his actions. We return to John as he pushes all the prisoners together, causing a commotion. When he struggles to subdue them all, he heads toward the electrical panel, grabbing knives and using the electricity to shock the prisoners on the floor. They fall to the ground, and Sandra, taken aback by his actions, tries to understand what is happening. John urgently asks Sandra for a map of the prison, explaining that there's no time to discuss details. He prevents Neil from entering the office. That night, John strikes Neil with a punch, sending him flying away. He then asks Sandra for her backup map and races to her desk, searching for it himself until he finds it. From the map, he determines the number of exits and entrances available in the prison. John speculates that Omar's men may not have escaped through the main gates and suggests that Omar is keeping the police occupied with the prisoners. He also confides in Sandra about his thoughts. John is convinced that 3 inmates are still unaccounted and inquires about the location of the old sewage system in the prison. He learns that the inmates might have escaped through the sewer, and at the same time, we see the 3 individuals walking through the old pipes. John suspects that there's a camp within the prison that could aid them in digging through the sewer. We hear Omar communicating with his men, tracking their movements in the pipes as they attempt to escape. Meanwhile, John and Sandra analyze the sewer system. She informs him that there are more than 9 inspection chambers throughout the prison. As ideas form in John's mind, he examines a pipe and realizes it is the prison's water line. He rushes to the inspection chamber, retrieves a crowbar, and begins to pry the pipe open with all his strength until it finally breaks. The pipe bursts, and water floods into the inspection chamber, creating chaos in the area. At night, 3 prisoners find themselves submerged in the water. John opens each inspection chamber one by one, carefully distancing himself from the others. He pulls out the first inmate, and after a struggle, he takes him out before moving on to the next chamber. He grabs the second prisoner by the leg, but as he tries to pull out the third, the inmate escapes into the water. John dives after him, managing to catch him and pull him out. Meanwhile, Omar is inside the prison, witnessing the pipes burst. He returns to his crew of hackers and inquires about the situation within the prison. He is shocked to learn that the police have gained control of the systems, making it difficult for his men to reach their comrades. He orders them to regain control swiftly before anything disastrous happens. As Neil approaches, he tries to apprehend John, but Sandra intervenes, informing him that John is the one capable of capturing the inmates. It is revealed that this gang consists of explosives experts with a notorious reputation. Omar hacks into the systems and speaks to them, indicating that he doesn't want anything from the prison. Omar, speaking to Sandra, silences her and clarifies that he's not addressing her but pointing at John. As the 2 men exchange challenging glares, Omar demands that John remove himself from the situation, emphasizing that he is neither in his homeland nor in a prison of his country. John defies him, asserting that he will destroy anyone who dares to even think about harming India. He further warns Omar that he will not be able to escape the country, as he possesses the keys to its entrances and exits. Omar counters, revealing that the entire prison is essentially under his control due to his hacking. He challenges John again, stating that while he has breached the prison security, John won't be able to do the same, and he knows exactly what he is doing. Omar's men grow anxious, urging him to leave, but he remains tense and unresponsive. The narrative shifts to reveal the underlying conflict between Omar and John. We see John reminiscing about the time when a group of prisoners grew anxious and fearful upon the entrance of a guard, who arrives before they have even formed for morning roll call. We discover that John is the warden of the prison. As he supervises the morning roll call, he notices that one prisoner is missing. Meanwhile, Omar's men are seen capturing a fugitive prisoner, lifting him onto a tree, and taking him back to his cell. Afterward, Omar contacts John to negotiate a significant deal, asking for the return of the escaped prisoner in exchange for a large sum of money. John flatly refuses, insults Omar, and hangs up the phone. He then begins to investigate the situation, informing his men that intelligence has been compromised and that he plans to leave the prison. As John prepares to exit, Omar calls him again, threatening that if he informs the police, he will deeply regret it. Once more, John hangs up on him, seemingly lost in thought. The next day, the captured prisoner is given a dose of a sedative to elicit a confession. Under interrogation, he reveals that Omar is the leader of a major terrorist group planning to detonate bombs in 3 major cities in India, marking them as one of the largest terrorist factions. The captured prisoner confesses that he is part of the plan orchestrated by Omar, which involves 3 inmates in London. This revelation sheds light on the long-standing animosity between Omar and John, revealing how their rivalry began. Later, we see John out with his wife and daughter at a cafe when he receives another call from Omar. He steps away to take the call, but as they speak, an explosion rocks the area. The blast disorients him, causing a ringing in his ears. Despite the chaos, he rushes back to his family, only to find that his wife has died in the explosion. Devastated, he collapses beside her, gripped by grief. His daughter, who is also injured and calling out for him, is quickly scooped up by John, who races her to the hospital. The doctor informs him that she has suffered multiple strokes from the shock and trauma of the explosion. In the hospital, John witnesses the devastation around him as families mourn their loved ones. And when he learns the severity of his daughter's condition, he decides to resign from his job to take care of her. Meanwhile, in the prison, the gang informs the confessing inmate that they will carry out the plan against the targets that night. At night, the prisoners climb over the walls and attempt to escape, but they are shocked to find John waiting for them. He reveals that he has made a deal with those who are helping them escape, effectively trapping them in their own treachery. Meanwhile, Omar calls John, threatening him with his daughter's life. John realizes that there is a traitor among the guards who has been informing Omar of his movements. In a tense confrontation, John raises his weapon and shoots the corrupt guard, killing him. He then turns his gun on the terrorist, accusing him of being the one responsible for their predicament. The police, responding to the situation, kill the terrorist in defense of the fallen guard. Omar, unable to bear witnessing one of his men being taken down, threatens John with vengeance for what he has done. However, John remains unfazed, warning Omar that he will always have to watch his back. The scene shifts back to John as he continues his conversation with Sandra, explaining that he didn't know the police were involved in the operation against them. Sandra informs John that the terrorists have surrounded the prison and have compromised the security systems. Together, they brainstorm a plan, and Sandra suggests signaling for a helicopter to rescue them from the terrorists. She reassures John that the helicopter will arrive in 4 hours. Meanwhile, the scene cuts to a character in a coma, highlighting the grim reality of the situation as we see John's daughter in her hospital room from a distance. They see Nancy's brother and approach him, asking what he wants. He demands to take the girl, but he refuses to hand her over, ordering him to return to his room. Meanwhile, Omar orders Hussein to storm the kitchen and torture the staff until they die, ensuring that the police and John will come to confront them. He reassures his men that there are no cameras capturing their actions and everything is under his control. Hussein and his men arrive at the kitchen, kicking down the door and brutally beating one of the staff members. They continue to torture him until Hussein lifts a large rock and strikes him in the chest, killing him. Simultaneously, Omar warns John that if he doesn't release his men, he will finish off everyone with. He instructs Hussein to bring in 16 as a new victim to suffer the same fate as the first, and they proceed to beat her mercilessly. Determined to intervene, John grabs a hammer and charges into the room, leaping through the flames to confront them. As he fights back, he fiercely defends the girl, taking blows meant. Hussein continues to assault her, raising a stone to kill her. But John races toward him, smashing the hammer into the rock and confronting Hussein's men who gather around him to overpower him. In a desperate moment, John sacrifices himself, enduring the punishment to protect the girl, feeling a surge of empathy for her suffering. John emerges wielding a flaming log, ready to fight Hussein and his men, defending his friends while the cooks rush to hide from the prisoners. The cooks, terrified, plead with John to protect them. That night, John gathers the cooks and informs them that no one will defend them. They must defend themselves. His first plan is to focus the cameras on Omar, preparing to strike back. He charges at the door, sending the prisoners sprawling to the ground. As he and the cooks emerge, their faces covered with plastic bags, they surprise the prisoners. They fling the bags at, creating chaos as John slashes through with knives. The prisoners are caught off guard, their vision obscured, allowing John and the cooks to overpower them. They manage to force their way inside, seeking refuge from the chaos. Meanwhile, the person who was previously in a coma contacts Omar, informing him that John's daughter is in the hospital. He seizes this opportunity to use her as leverage against John, planning to threaten it with her safety. The person looks up to see Nancy's brother standing before him, demanding to know what he wants. He insists on releasing the girl in exchange for 10,000 rupees. Meanwhile, back in the prison, the inmates are trying to force the door open against the police. Sandra, feeling terrified, asks John what they will do. John requests weapons, but Sandra informs him that they have breached all the doors, making it impossible to reach her. In a quick move, John ties a rope into a grappling hook and manages to grab Sandra. He then opens the door for the inmates, while Sandra stands behind him, lifting her weapon and firing at the ground. The sound frightens the inmates, causing them to scatter in fear. Sandra continues to fire at them until they retreat into the cell where they are imprisoned. Meanwhile, Nancy's brother is scheming to extract the girl with the help of another doctor. He instructs her to take his sister away from the girl. The doctor successfully manages to get Nancy out of the room, but it's clear that Nancy is anxious and uneasy about the girl's safety. The doctor rushes in to take the girl, assuring her that he will return her to her father. However, we find out that he has hidden her under a trolley and hands her over to the gang member. Meanwhile, Omar accesses the cameras and threatens John, warning him that if he doesn't comply, there will be consequences. Sandra breaks down and pleads with him to let her go, but John remains calm, knowing that Omar will never be afraid or hand over his country. Despite Sandra's frantic cries, John reassures her that his daughter is brave and can defend herself well. Indeed, the girl manages to escape from the gang, and they search for her everywhere. When Sandra sees the girl, she quickly takes a baton from her hand and aims it at one of the gang members. At the same time, Neil screams and informs Sandra that the inmates have attacked him. Sandra sprints after a group of them, armed with a rifle, firing at. Meanwhile, John chases one of the gang members across the rooftops, and as the chaos unfolds, we see the inmates attacking Sandra. They wrestle with her until they manage to take the rifle away from her. Amidst the chaos, John, still pursuing his target, swings down from the rooftops and grabs onto a rope. As John struggles to pull them up, he notices that the money for the operation has fallen from his pocket. He quickly contacts the gang, informing Omar that the girl has escaped. Furious, Omar orders his men to bring her back by any means necessary. Meanwhile, while hanging from the rope, John manages to retrieve the money and heads back up to the prison. However, Omar's men ambush him, attacking him with weapons. John fights back fiercely, pushing through the assault until he finally makes it back inside. In the chaos, he hears gunfire and rushes toward the sound, engaging in a fierce battle with the gang members. They manage to wrestle the gun from him, leaving him momentarily vulnerable. After a tough scuffle, he regains his footing and finds the money, handing it over to his ally, Bara. As they make their escape, John notices that Neil is about to betray him and lets the gang members attack him instead. Bara is left to fend for himself, caught in the crossfire, while John struggles to keep himself and his allies alive amidst the unfolding chaos. Bara jumps in front of John, taking all the bullets in his body as he sacrifices himself for his friend. John is left in shock as the gang members close in on him. Meanwhile, the girl, Nancy, is running away from the gang, but suddenly gets tired and begs her brother to take her back to their father. He picks her up and starts running when John's phone rings. Nancy's brother sees it and grabs it, but she quickly intervenes, taking the phone from him and running away with it. As she tries to convince him to give the gang the money to help their father, he refuses, insisting they need to keep the girls safe. Nancy shouts at him, opposing his plan, and decides to report him instead. In the ensuing struggle, she grabs a pair of scissors and stabs him, then picks up a glass bottle, repeatedly smashing it over his head until he collapses to the ground. With her brother incapacitated, Nancy escapes with the girl, hiding from the gang in an ambulance nearby. Realizing the situation is slipping away, Omar calls his men, ordering them to return and capture the girl before she can get too far. With no time to lose, and the plane approaching, the gang searches for a vehicle but finds an ambulance with keys inside. They take Nancy, along with the girl, back to the prison. Meanwhile, John confronts the prisoners who are trying to escape. He fights them off, using chains to secure them to a pipe. That night, Niall sneaks up behind him and knocks him out with a heavy object, dragging him into a pipe to subdue him. Sandra arrives and questions Niall about John's whereabouts, but he denies seeing it. She cuffs him to a pipe, revealing that she knows the truth, that he is a traitor. The plane arrives, and there are numerous casualties on the ground as it attempts to land. Omar and his men begin shooting at the aircraft, while Nancy's brother hears the girl's voice from inside the ambulance. They take her to use as leverage against her father, but they can't locate. Fearing for the girl's safety, Sandra reluctantly agrees to hand over the prisoners in exchange for the girl's release, hoping to strike a deal that will keep her safe. John hands over the prisoners, signaling for them to return with the girl. Gunfire erupts around Sandra, causing panic. The girl screams for her father, prompting John to leap out of the pipe, shocking everyone as he lifts the cover and engages in a fierce battle with the gang members. He takes a weapon from one of them and fights off the rest while protecting Sandra. During the chaos, one of the gang members pulls out knives and attacks John, injuring him in the shoulders. Despite this, John manages to defeat the attacker just as he spots Omar rushing for a gun on the ground. He calls out to his daughter, signaling her to grab the weapon. She runs, but as she reaches for it, a gang member stabs Sandra in the abdomen. In a moment of desperation, John charges at the attacker, sending him flying away from Sandra. He continues to fight off the remaining gang members and successfully drives them back into the prison. The police finally arrive, apprehending Niall and freeing Nancy. Later, John wakes up in the hospital, still shaken from the events. Fortunately, the girl has undergone surgery and is recovering well. Sandra expresses her gratitude to John for his support and tells him that the least they can do for him is to ensure the girl's health. She offers to return his money, but asks him to give it to the authorities instead, demonstrating their bond forged through the harrowing experience.